But I think we can all see, and even I have learned a lot. I didn't fully know this until I started explaining it. It's a battle over the target position, over posturing of the kings, which is what makes it so complicated. There's all these intricate maneuvers as both sides try to insist on and fulfill their own goal. Table base makes this all look very, very easy. This is quite brilliant, actually. So Caruana MVL, a game which by now is pretty famous. I'll begin this by saying for my YouTube audience, that this analysis is going to have significantly more mistakes than, some other recaps, because I'm not going to use the engine. And the reason I don't use the engine is because, well, there's a couple. I won't go into it too much, but, well, first of all, it's not as fun for me, selfishly. Second of all, you can use the engine yourself and look over the game, and you can learn a lot about it, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think I view my job as somebody who can be a conduit between you, the viewer, and the minds of the GMs. And when you use the engine to figure everything out, the lines between what the players were thinking and what the engines are saying begins to be blurred. So you don't have a good sense of what actually was going on. So I'm going to make a lot of mistakes and stuff. And those of you in the chat who have looked at the game with an engine, you guys can correct me and stuff. I don't mind that. I might turn the engine on in a couple of moments, but I won't have it on throughout the whole game. So this is a poison pawn Najdorf, as you guys know. And Najdorf, bishop g5, e6, MVL, back to what he's been playing for essentially his whole life, which is the poison pawn variation against bishop g5. And Fabi plays queen d2. The poison pawn has a pretty interesting history. It was first played in the year 1899, which is quite incredible. And then it was played the second time in 1954. It was played a lot by Russian players, so it's been around for over 50 years. It's been around for over 50 years, and the theory has grown and grown and grown, and then when the computers appeared, it grew exponentially. So Fischer played it. People knew about this in the pre-computer time, but nobody really suspected how incredibly complicated it was until, 10, 15 years ago, and it got really, really popular again. So in the old days, people used to play the move f5 here, and even bishop b2. Nowadays, e5 is the very topical move. So e5 is still very much theory. h6, that's also the theoretical response, counterattacking the bishop. The bishop drops to h4. Taking the knight here doesn't make any sense because takes the knight, takes the pawn. This dark squared bishop is an incredibly valuable attacker for white. You can say, oh, but wait a second, I win the pawn back, but you've helped black develop his pieces, and after knight c6, white's in big trouble because this bishop is x-raying the knights, white has no attack. The whole point of the poison pawn is, well, to sacrifice a pawn for an attack. So bishop h4, d, e, f, e. And this often occurs via the move order takes, h6, bishop h4. That's also possible. It's just a transposition. Takes. Knight fd7. This is still incredibly common theory. Knight e4 by Fabi, centralizing his knight and sacrificing essentially 2 more pawns. So it's quite rare for a gambit in theory to sacrifice 3 pawns, but that's exactly what this is. MVL takes on a2. This is still over almost 2,000 games in this position. Rook has to move. And MVL goes queen d5, the main line. And you guys are welcome to ask questions, by the way. So knight takes c5 here. It has never been played, and for a very, very good reason. As you guys can see, the queen x-rays the d8 square. And white will have to choose very carefully where to put the knight. But among other things, knight f5 looks incredibly strong because queen d8 mate is a threat and knight d6 is a threat. Black is busted. So it's time for MVL to evacuate the queen d5. Still, very much still theory. I know that's a meme, but it is theory. And Fabi shifts his queen to e3, main line, opening up the rook's x-ray on the queen and protecting both of his knights. And now queen takes e5. So don't be under any illusions here. Still about 1,800 games in this position. But this is where crazy stuff begins to happen because almost everybody exclusively has gone bishop e2. And bishop e2 is essentially considered forced. Just for your information, in my reference, it's showing 1,726 games with bishop b2, and the move that Fabi played, c3, has 12 games, and not a single one of those 12 by anybody particularly strong. There's a couple of correspondence games. It's insane that he found a move this early. Now, the reason bishop b2 is the main line is quite simple. I mean, you're just developing your bishop. It's a crazy position, super complicated. Another reason is that you're stopping the move f5, which seems to win the knight, and now bishop h5 just literally leads to checkmate. So that's the other idea, bishop b2. And now the main line continues, bishop c5, then bishop g3, and now recently MVL has started to play queen to d5. We're not going to delve into this position. This is incredibly computerish theory, and a lot of these games often end in draws. I don't think he found it at the board. Trust me, Fabi has known this theory since he was probably 5 years old. This is incredibly common. Everybody knows this. c3 nobody has ever seen before. I don't know if the engine gives the move c3 as its top choice. I can check. If we turn on Stockfish, yeah, so you can see bishop b2 is the main move. Now this is a pretty low depth. My computer's running very slowly because I'm also streaming. Yeah, it's particularly slow. Let me see. It shouldn't be this slow. But okay, you can see bishop b2 is the move. And if we expand the list of moves, c3 is number 2. c3 is mentioned. It's number 2, but it says black is better. It says black is better after bishop e7, which MVL did not play. And this is what people really struggle with. A lot of you might say, well, why would Caruana prepare this if white is worse? But minus 0.3 might not be telling the whole story. Remember, this is a super irrational position. Black is 3 pawns up. So minus 0.3 doesn't tell you anything about the position and how hard it is to play from a human perspective. I'm seeing that people ran this on depth 42. It's only 0.2. So white takes, white goes knight f3. And I think Fabi's point and what his team discovered is that this is just a very hard position to play for black. So let's say bishop e2, for example. And the computer gives like an only move, only moves that lead to a slight edge for black. But maybe that final position, 10 moves in, is actually equal. You don't know. So that's the bottom line. And this move c3, it's not a novelty. It's been played before. But it also should be mentioned that against the main move, bishop e2, the main continuation is bishop c5. So figuring out that you have to go bishop e7 here and get your king out into the center like this would have been incredibly hard for MVL. And all of these decisions that go into these moves, it's not just Fabi turning on his engine and letting it sit for a day. It's also these human decisions. Will MVL find bishop e7? That's why you hire a whole team of people to make all those decisions and to analyze the hell out of this. I mean, he literally had a year. So does that make sense so far? Like, what is the actual point behind c3? We're about to find out, because MVL played bishop c5, as you usually do after bishop e2. And the point here, first Fabi drops his bishop to g3. This is still not a novelty, 6 games. And after queen d5 comes the absolutely shocking novelty. This probably will be the novelty of the year. Now, you guys might notice the x-ray of the rook against the queen. The problem is that you can't move the knight because the bishop is going to capture white's queen. And in this position, everybody who reached this position went bishop to d6, sacking the bishop, and then knight b5, opening up the attack on the queen. But this is not as good as it looks because black can just sack the queen. And black has a rook apiece and 3 pawns for the queen, and white's initiative fizzles out here. But Fabi plays bishop c4, sacking the other bishop. Insane. Getting the bishop out, sacrificing it, just to get the queen onto a vulnerable square. And only now does he play the move bishop to d6, which of course stops black from castling. And now the vulnerability of this queen is revealed because you can't take the bishop, you get forked. And black is up a piece and 3 pawns, and despite all that, he has an incredibly hard time moving a single piece because of white's incredible pressure here. So that's just insane. Now, for example, if MVL tries to bring his knight out, let's say knight c6, right? what did Fabi have in mind here? Well, I think bishop takes c5 is totally devastating, because after knight takes c5, the d6 square has been cleared, and this is a fork against black's king. So, insanely, it's tremendously hard to make a move. White is threatening bishop takes c5. You might look at this and say, well, what about taking the knight here with the bishop? Okay, but now the rook takes the bishop, the queen has to move. And look at this position just with your own eyes. Black cannot move a muscle. White just castles, white gets pressure down the f-file. This looks completely lost for black, even though he's up a zillion pieces. There's just nothing to talk about or analyze here. And if queen takes c5, by the way, well, queen takes c5 is impossible. You just take the queen. And MVL was sitting there just in disbelief, and he found what I think is a good idea. He found a way to give away his bishop such that he gets a little bit of breathing room for his pieces. Okay. Now, can't black sack his queen after rook d4? Well, this is a different situation than this situation. Here, black's pieces are fine. Whites are all over the place. In this position, black is completely paralyzed. Thank you, Jaren, gifting the subs. Right? And white's threatening queen g7. It's not just about the material advantage. It's also about the fact that black can't move anything. MVL finds the best move, knight to f6. Okay, so he's getting his knight to a civilized square. He's making room for the other knight, potentially. And he's immediately challenging the knight on e4. So if you play bishop c5, well, that would be very bad, because MVL would take on e4. And so Skybob was just those of you just joining. All of this was theory up until Fabi's 16th move c3. Incredibly common theory. MVL should have taken all those pawns. The poison pawn variation is a bit of a misnomer. The pawn is not actually truly poisoned. So I think some people will be under the illusion that MVL went into some line that's always been considered bad. Poison pawn is one of the most topical lines of the night of. MVL spent 30 minutes. Thank you for letting me know. So does everybody understand? Bishop c5, knight e4 is bad because you drop the bishop and you have no knight to give a fork with. So Fabi has to play knight takes c5. And MVL centralizes his knight on d5. Now he's up 3 pawns. Fabi has won the piece back. And white's queen is under attack. Fabi has to move it. And Fabi moves it to e5, essentially sacrificing a 4th pawn. MVL didn't take it. And the reason MVL didn't take it is because I think it would have helped white. White would have played king f2, coordinating the rooks. It seems to me that this standoff between the queens is probably in white's favor, given how active white's pieces are. In addition, the c-file being open doesn't seem significant, right? But if black plays rook g8, I think rook c1 might be a very nasty move here, creating tremendous pressure against black's bishop. So at this point, MVL's point is just to try to get his pieces out. He doesn't care about any more pawns. He's up 3 pawns. That's enough. Now, this pawn on g7 is hanging, and if white takes it, the rook is going to be trapped. So MVL goes rook to g8. There were other ways to defend the pawn, but they were bad. Who can find that white's response had MVL played f6? Okay, queen h5 check is correct, guys. f6 creates a devastating weakness. And this is, well, the king can't go to d7, it has to go to d8, and this is totally crushing. This is totally, totally crushing. The queen swoops in. d5 is hanging. It's over. Any questions in this position? I just want to make sure everybody's on board with why things are looking very dangerous for black and why MVL has to make this ugly-looking move rook g8. So, as many of you are asking, why didn't Fabi now take the knight? Well, when you make a move like bishop takes b, you got to look at how the position changes, which pieces are no longer defended. And what immediately jumps out at me is that the knight on c5 has lost its defender, queen takes c5 happens, and all things held equal, trades are horrible for white. White's down a lot of pawns. So white's initiative fizzles out here. We have a question about why knight f6 can't be played, but here's the funny thing. After knight f6, this knight on c5 is now defended by the queen. So now I think Fabi could have considered taking. But in addition, MVL's knight just came from f6. The knight being on d5 renders the d-file closed, so I think a move like knight f5 would have been quite devastating as well. So MVL has to go here. Now Fabi sacrifices another piece. He plays knight d takes e6, ripping through the e-file. But this one I think is quite understandable. You know, you've, as the Russian expression goes, having said A, you have to say B. He's already sacked 3 pawns. Why not? You got to open up Black's king. And he does this to open up the e-file. The queen is now facing the king. MVL grabs it. And Fabi plays knight takes c6. So the first thing to mention is that if bishop takes e6, white vacuums up Black's hanging pieces. Queen e6. And now the simplest, I think, is just to take the rook and then to take the knight, and white is up a rook. And I'm sure there's other wins here. There's maybe even a mate. You could probably take the knight first. That's not possible. The other way to deal with the threat of a discovered check is to move the king, but there's nowhere good to move it. In the event of king f7, in addition to just taking the knight, one line that jumps out at me, no, that's probably not good. So I think taking the knight would be sufficient. But I was thinking about rook f1 check, but the funny thing is, Black can even sack the queen, but even knight f6 seems to defend against the immediate threats. You can't castle through a check. Castling is illegal because the queen defends f1. But I think after rook d5, bishop e6, now rook f1 looks good. King g6. Black is running away, which is kind of funny. Queen takes e6, the king runs away to h7. Here Black looks relatively safe, although probably after something like bishop e5, white is still winning. Yeah, I wonder what the exact mating line here is, although I'm sure white has something. It just smells like checkmate. I call that safe. Well, it's safer than it was here. So I guess we'll have to look at that, but at what point, I don't know when Fabi was out of his prep. Maybe somebody could tell me, somebody who saw the press conference. I don't know when Fabi was out of his prep. That's the scary part. Well, queen f5, there's still knight f6. Let's check the engine here. I'm going to take one of my freebies and take a look at the engine here. We're only going to do that a couple of times, as I said. And amazingly, at least according to the initial evaluation, let's see. Well, knight d8, rook takes. Knight d8, I'm not sure what that does. Just blunders the knight. Let's see. It takes a second to load. So it's showing a draw. Believe it or not, king f7 is showing a draw at a pretty high depth now. And that's pretty insane, because what this tells you, and this is why I don't use an engine, guys. Every one of my quote-unquote grandmaster instincts says that king f7 should get mated. If you're looking at this with an engine initially, you see the move king f7. How could MVL not play this? It's such an obvious move. Well, it's not an obvious move. You go right into this check. After knight f6, it turns out, according to the engine, that white has nothing better than to sacrifice this knight and give this very interesting perpetual. And if black tries to block with g6, then white sacks the rook and swings the queen at e7 with mate. And rook takes d5, bishop takes c6. The line I gave is equal. It's dynamically equal, and white actually has to be the one to play accurately. Rook f8 is forced. That's a pretty hard move to see. And I guess this leads to a perpetual after queen takes c3. Because black's king is in tremendous danger, so black has to check white's king ad nauseum. So it is safe. And it appears that queen takes c3, MVL's move, was still fine. Also leads to equality. But this endgame which arose seems to me to be very hard to play for black. So king f7 was a chance for MVL to draw the game, essentially by force. But instead, Maxime goes queen c3 check, which forces a queen trade. And we get into an amazing scenario where the queens have been traded. MVL is a piece up and 2 pawns up, and yet he's not winning or anything of the sort. In fact, he's the one on his back feet. And the reason is that Fabi starts with a check, knight c7, that's a fork. Okay, MVL drops his king to f7, but of course, if you take the rook, well then black takes white's rook, and the position fizzles out, and black is up 2 pawns. That's no good. But Fabi goes rook to d3. Very important intermediate move. There's a couple things to understand here. The knight is hanging, the rook is hanging. Black is still extremely underdeveloped. And the king is very, very weak. Just because the queens have been traded doesn't mean that the king is all of a sudden safe. Fabi now in his pocket has the ability to castle with check. That might be a good idea. Okay. So MVL decides that the best approach is to prioritize the safety of his king. And he gives up the rook. He goes 94. Remember that he's still up a piece and up 2 pawns. So even after giving up the rook, he's going to be, technically speaking, material is going to be approximately equal. Now, some of you might be wondering, why didn't he go rook a7? I'm wondering the same thing. And my guess is that the reasoning is quite mundane. Perhaps just rook takes c3. And if we can imagine that, let's say black develops his knight, white can castle with check, but I even think rook g3 comes to mind. What is the point of this move? The point of this move is to control g6 with the rook. Castles is literally a mate threat. This is a hilarious checkmate. Okay, you can play like this with this as mate. But apparently this is what black was supposed to do. And perhaps the move knight d7 comes to mind here in order to meet castles with knight f6, kind of like what MVL did, just without giving up the rook. And who can tell me why this move doesn't trap the rook? You guys might be looking to say, wait a minute. Black's rook is trapped. Black's rook is lost. Why is that not the case? What are we missing here? It's not a fork. The knight is pinned by the white's rook. No, not 94. The knight is pinned. The move is b6, creating a square for the rook. It's funny how black has been giving away his extra pieces until now he's got an extra pawn. And white is not worse here after, let's say, bishop d4. Clearly, white's piece activity will compensate for the extra pawn, but we have opposite colored bishops. Sorry. We have opposite colored bishops. No, that's not the good move. I meant to play rook d8. It seems like black has finally gotten his pieces into the game, and the position is going to fizzle out into a draw. So apparently, as people in the chat are indicating, rook a7 was the last chance to maintain dynamic equality. So some of you, and YouTube people as well, might be looking at this analysis and progressively saying, I thought this was a great novelty, but I'm discovering that it was all bluff. Well, it wasn't all bluff. Chess has essentially been exhausted. These openings have been exhausted to the point where nobody's going to refute them anymore. All that you can find are ways to test your opponent and make your opponent find difficult moves. And doing that is no less meaningful than refuting some line at this point. That's what novelties are about in the modern day. Dynamic equality, by the way, when I use that phrase, it means a position that's not literally balanced in the sense that it's rook and 3 versus rook and 3. The position is unbalanced, but still equal. So, for example, a situation in which you have full compensation for a pawn, but not more, is dynamic equality. One side is up a pawn, but the other side is full compensation. Okay. Knight e4 was played by MVL. Fabi castles with check. MVL goes king g6. So I suppose he didn't want to play knight f6. He just centralizes his knight. And now, after knight c6, Fabi is up in exchange for 2 pawns. Thank you, Smoother Planet. But MVL has finally gotten his pieces out, and the king is now safe. One of the functions that this knight fulfills is covering the g3 square, so this is no longer possible. Fabi's knight is now in trouble, so he has to drop it back. And MVL goes rook to d8, pinning the bishop to the rook, and forcing Fabi's hand. The bishop is in trouble. If you try to go rook f to d1, defending the bishop, then bishop g4 comes out. That's no good for white because the rook doesn't have this square. And Fabi must therefore give up this hero of a knight. Knight c8, rook c8. The position finally begins to fizzle out into an endgame, to something that we can really follow and understand. But it's still tremendously complex. The big thing to understand is that when you have a situation where one side is up in exchange, the fact that it's an endgame is good for the side of the 2 rooks, because the knights are not long-range pieces. And what the knights have the hardest time doing is multitasking. Because the knight is a short-range piece, think of it this way. Either the knight supervises the queenside pawns, or, thank you, Perdome, no, I don't want to play this move. Either it supervises the queenside pawns, or it supervises the king. And the knights cannot apportion these tasks pretty well. They're just overextended. They're not very good defensive pieces, and Fabi utilizes that in the next couple of moves to get more favorable transformations, if that makes sense. So, to that effect, If, let's finally make this move, let's say MVL pushes b5. Well, what is the drawback of this move? One way to consider it is that the knight on c6 loses its protector. Rook c1 happens, and, well, the pawns are not going to go very far. Now, is bishop takes b4 a good move here? Yes or no? No. Knight takes b4, you might be excited. We win the rook. But black takes the other rook. So you gotta be careful, but no problem. White can drop the bishop back. And black's pawns are not going to get very far anyway. Because look at how the rooks are able to hit both knights. And very, very quickly, you're going to get a situation where the knights are driven off the board. The pawns lose their protection, and the rook just mops them up pretty easily. So it might be confusing to some people why MVL didn't push his pawns. Well, that's why. The pawns wouldn't go anywhere anyway. MVL goes rook c7 instead. He's actually protecting his pawns. Fabi plays rook f4, kicking the knight away. After knight f6, the bishop has done its job on a3. He repositions it to b2, putting more pressure on the knight. MVL tries to bring the other knight to help the king side. Fabi trades in order to ruin black's kingside pawn structure in the anticipation that he's going to win one of these pawns. That's totally reasonable. And Fabi pushes h4. So he grabs some space on the king side. He prevents king g5. And, you know, he's got the idea of going rook d6 and perhaps going g4. So MVL stops the progress of his pawns with h5. But in doing so, the pawn on h5 now becomes a weakness, and Fabi finds a very, very nice sequence. Rook g3 check. The king has to stick to the f pawn. It can't go to the h file. It can't lose this pawn. After king f7, using this pin, Fabi goes rook g5, hitting the pawn. There's no good way to defend it. But MVL does find a way to get a pawn in return. Rook c1 check is played. Fabi hides his king, and I hope everybody's following so far. We're reaching that final endgame. If anybody has questions or wants me to repeat something, please don't hesitate. And now knight g6 by Maxime, attacking the rook and attacking the pawn. Now the rook can't abandon the other rook. You can't go to e4, because then you drop the rook. Don't forget that you have to keep the king pinned, but that means dropping the h pawn. So knight h4, rook h5. But on the plus side, Fabi goes rook h7, and this really shows how good rooks are at being long-range pieces. They can swing from one side of the board to the other effortlessly, and it's clear that MVL is going to lose this pawn as well. And he doesn't try particularly hard to cling to it. What he does decide is that he's going to trade another pair of rooks. And he's going to consider, or he's going to seek his chances in this endgame. Now, it's important, again, to point out that this pawn is not going to be sustained by the knight. There's no way that the knight is going to be able to defend this pawn in the long run, and MVL doesn't even try. He goes rook d6. If MVL goes knight b4, this could only backfire, could get the knight trapped. Right? If Fabi's going to go rook b6, then rook b5. So MVL says, all right, whatever. I'm going to go knight e5, I'm going to give this pawn up, and we're going to get what's going to, I think, become a very, very famous endgame. Very famous endgame. But there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces. This is a table-based endgame. And initially, it was a table-based draw. Now, there's a couple of things which must be established for you guys to understand this endgame. The first thing is that rook against knight, unless there are particularly extenuating circumstances, like the knight is on a1, is a draw. Rook against knight is a draw. So simply trading pawns would not be helpful to white. Now, if we can, let's try to understand this conceptually. How do we even understand this endgame? Why does it look like a draw? Well, it looks like a draw because it looks like black has a fortress. In order to win the game, black is going to have to win the f6 pawn. Right? That's not a controversial statement. And that's incredibly hard to do because the knight simply keeps the king away, and the rook alone is not going to be able to win this pawn. Now, as you're thinking about it, maybe you develop the idea of bringing the pawn to g5 and using the pin to win the pawn. Well, that's also easier said than done, because the knight's not going to relinquish its control of the g5 square. In order to make progress, then, white has to go one step before winning the pawn. In order to think about how to trick black, Fabi must have been thinking, well, let's work backwards. Let's reverse engineer this. What needs to happen in order for me to win the f6 pawn? Well, he comes up with a pretty clear statement. Thank you, Red Hobo, for the 5. He's going to have to push black's king back at some point so that white's king can come to f5 and try to maneuver around the knight's checks. White's going to have to push black's defensive construction off the board. And does that make sense? That's the target position. That's what they're fighting over. They're fighting over king position. If white can get his king to f5 or e6, probably black's not going to be able to hold on and pry the king away from the pawn. But if MVL can hold this construction in one way or another, he's going to be able to hold the draw. Okay, so Fabi shuffles for a little bit. He goes king e4, rook a5, knight f7. MVL just goes back and forth. And he goes knight f5. Notice that Fabi tries to give a check on g3. MVL just stops him. Whether or not this check is dangerous remains to be seen. Rook d3. This is kind of Zugzwang. The knight has to move. And now comes the most important position in the game. I haven't checked the engine on this. Grandmaster posted on Facebook, Evgeny Posny, that, okay, not this, but like, not yet. This is still fine, I think. And perhaps somebody could correct me on this. This is still fine. I think the critical moment comes, so they're shuffling around. Now notice how Fabi has, okay, knight h6 was the blunder apparently. I don't think it is. Let me check. I'm going to check table bases myself just to make sure I'm not lying to you guys. Yes, Hikaru is correct. Knight h6 is the decisive mistake. Okay. Knight h6 is decisive mistake. Made in 43. No, this is the decisive mistake. And then Fabi makes a mistake. And then MVL makes a mistake here. Oh, the second knight h6. So this is still fine. Let me see. Wow, knight c7. That's just insane. This is so complicated. I'm just checking something. Yeah, this is going to be very hard to understand. Okay. So I think I've understood it. I've understood at least one thing. In order to try to understand this endgame, we need to create a target position, Andrew FB. A target position is a position which, if we reach this position, we know the evaluation. And if we reason back from target positions, we can understand what they're fighting for. Because otherwise, like, these moves have no meaning. Like, why is this move bad? Why is that move good? Now, to me, it seems that the target position is one in which white's king has reached h5. So let me make a couple of random moves here. Let's say we have this position. Okay. Now we know, as I've said earlier, that eventually the king wants to reach the pawn. But this represents a lot of progress. Robert Hess made a very insightful point in the commentary, or I think Howell did or somebody did. The king on the h-file is very hard to check. The knight only has a couple of ways to check this king. There's no way to pry the king away from the h-file. If you consider the king on f5, right, particularly in this position, the king can't hold on to its enviable perch. The knight just goes knight e7, and because of the coordinated efforts of this and this, the king has to come back. Right? I hope that makes sense. But if you consider the king on h5, and you consider a knight check, the king doesn't have to go back to g4. It can go up to h6 and further up to h7, and it's going to evade the checks one way or another. Okay, so why is that a big deal, you might ask? Okay, great. Like, I don't care. Knight e7. Well, now I feel like using the rook to corral black's king and cause Zugzwang, white can inch the king further toward g7. This is not easy to do, but it appears to me that one plan is to go rook f3. Now, you're x-raying the pawn. And if the knight just chills, I think that g4, the aforementioned plan of pushing this pawn to g5, might be winning here. And one amazing line that I'm seeing, guys, oh my god, what does white have in this position? Find white's fastest win. This is pretty cool. this is pretty cool. I think white has g5, not necessary, but cool. g6, g7, and it just shows you how bad the knight is at stopping passers on the corner of the board. Check, king g6, and it's a win. That's a pretty cool line. Unnecessary, but cool. But all of this shows the king has to step aside in order to escape the pin. And now you go king g7, shouldering black's king. And at this point, all that remains is some mop-up work. Rook f4, knight d7, and one thing that comes to mind is rook f5. The idea is to tie yourself to this. Well, I guess rook f5, king e6, but maybe just check. And if knight e5, then the undermining move g5 wins because you can't take. And if the king moves aside, then we've reached essentially our ideal position. That's it. Black is going to lose this game. It's going to lose the f-pawn. So does this part make sense? Does it make sense why? And I've shown this very approximately. I'm sure there's more subtleties there. The bottom line to understand is that if white's king reaches the h-file, this becomes very unpleasant for black because it's hard to pry the king away from h5, and eventually the king will reach g6 and have a serious shot at winning the pawn. So the battle revolves, in a sense, around MVL stopping Fabi's king from reaching h5. But to reach h5, white will have to do two things. White will have to get the king away from g6 at some point and make sure that the knight isn't like on g7 at that moment, because that will bar the passage to h5. Okay, so what happens here is, I assume, the move knight h6 is a mistake because it allows Fabi, through some crazy sequence, to force his king onto h5. So let's understand, using table bases, right? We're going to turn table base on here just so I can guide you guys through this. What happens here? Why is this a mistake? So Fabi begins correctly. The correct move, by the way, which held the draw, was either knight e7 or knight g7. Now, I understand why knight g7 is good. I understand it, because the knight guards h5, and we agree that this is a target position. So, for example, if check, here, 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 congratulations. See, this is the key position, guys. The knight holds the h5 square. If you try to induce Zugzwang, the king can just go back to f8 and forward to f7. But the question is, well, what is the significance of knight g7? Why is this bad? Because this stops the king from coming to g4. So this is correct by Fabi. MVL goes king f7. Fabi plays king e4. That is correct. Now, this is a pretty nasty situation for MVL, because if he goes king to e6, then after rook b3, king back, now rook c3 is the move. What's going to happen here? Rook g3? Oh, that's the Zugzwang. So king e6, rook h3. Yeah, so this makes a lot of sense. I'm just running through the line to understand what's going on. Oh, now rook a6. So this knight on a6 is going to end up in a lot of trouble. That's pretty crazy. Even I don't understand the sequence fully. But the bottom line is, after knight g8, yep, here comes king g4. And here's king h5, and this is the fastest win. So the reason that this is losing is because the knight will not have enough squares to shuffle between, and eventually you're going to create Zugzwang with a knight on h6 and forcing the king to go to g4. Now, what is the purpose of these crazy rook maneuvers? Well, you want to basically catch black's king at a certain point so that you can do stuff. If you go rook g3 here, immediately, then black can go knight g8. And if you try to escape the gates, if you try to cross the gates, nope, then knight h6, shut down. Right, so you're trying to create a situation, and rook c3 is a waiting move, where black has to make a move that damages his fortress. If black drops the knight back to g8, then you go king f4, knight h6, rook g3, and there's the Zugzwang. There's the Zugzwang. If king f8, then you slide the rook in, and you can walk the king around already to h5. Or you can go king f5, and this is just winning after rook takes g8 with a winning pawn endgame. So This is Zugzwang, because if knight g8, then if king f8, rook g6. If knight g8, who can tell me the move? So just to make sure that you guys are understanding where we're going with this, what's the purpose of all of this? You know what the target position is. Now we can reach the target position. How? King g4. You get the king to h5. And if king g6, then you go king h4 check, essentially using this pin, forcing the king back, and we've reached the target position, which we already know is winning. So in a sense, that's all there is to it. You have to waste a move in this position to force either black's knight back, which allows white's king to f4, or force black's king to move, which gives white a chance to deliver this check, which creates the Zugzwang position we've already discussed. And it appears to me that knight h6 is a mistake, because the knight is not able to shuffle between enough squares. When you bring the knight in the center, it has more squares that it can shuffle between. Here, white can cause this Zugzwang because the knight essentially only has one square. The king on f7 is blocking the knight from a very important shuffle square. Okay, so let's see how knight g7, we already saw knight g7. Here, white can waste all the moves that he wants to waste, right? White can waste all the moves that he wants to waste. The knight cannot be dislodged from g7. This is a literal fortress. This knight is stopping white's king from coming to h5, and black's king has enough squares that it can go to so that the knight essentially never has to move. A Zugzwang is a position in which every move causes harm to your position. Okay, so let's see what Fabi did. Knight h6, boom, boom, boom. He goes king e4 correctly. MVL goes knight g8. Fabi repeats moves. King f5, king f4. That does nothing. But the amazing thing is that MVL's knight is unable to reach g7. That's the critical square for the knight. But here Fabi makes a mistake. He goes king g4. And that mistake allows black to make a draw. The correct approach would have been to repeat moves and then get back on the right track with this rook b3 idea. Rook b3, and then rook b6. And now the win is elementary. You can go king f5 and king g4. Oh no, king g4 you can't go because of king g6. So no, it's not elementary. But the move is rook b6 and actually g3. And that's the Zugzwang. Rook b7 tying down the king. And now who can tell me the winning idea here? Once the king gets to e6, the target position is very easily reachable. Where should white's king go? Boom. 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 Easy. Target position, king on h5, and we already have discussed that this is winning. So all of this revolves around the king's ability to get to h5, and both posturing for position trying to prevent the other from getting it done. Fabi goes king g4, and this blocks the rook's access of the g-file, which allowed king g6. MVL played it. MVL correctly goes king f7. And all of a sudden now, the knight can reach g7 again. MVL simply did not understand that the correct drawing plan is to put the knight on g7. That is the only drawing plan. Now, what is the fastest path that the knight has to g7, ladies and gentlemen? It's to go here. And that's why the computer suggests that move. The king can try to reach h5. Almost there, but no. Knight g7 just in time. We already know this is a draw. Now black has a complete fortress. Am I making any sense? I hope I'm making some sense here. At least in the sense of like describing what they're fighting over. It's very hard for me because even I don't understand entirely the point of all of these crazy moves. But I think we've figured out what both sides are fighting for and what the general ideas here are. So knight e7 is the mistake, and now Fabi goes back to the right plan. King e4. And Fabi goes rook h3, stopping king h6, and this is all fine. King g6, rook a3. And what happens here, he finally reverts back to the correct idea. MVL doesn't put up much of a fight because, so knight g8, because we already know that this is the key Zugzwang position. We had this in our analysis earlier. And once again, this is Zugzwang. Classic Zugzwang. MVL moved his knight, which allowed Fabi to reach the target position, and he won soon after. If the king had moved, I remind you that we slide the rook in, force the knight back, and the easiest is to go king f5 here. Wait a minute, isn't this a fork? Well, no, because this is a winning pawn endgame. Yeah, Lionel Carter, I'll explain in a second. If the king goes to e6, well, then the same thing is possible here, here, here. Sorry, king g4. Probably not the fastest, but possible. And so MVL goes knight g8. Fabi gets his king to h5. He understood that this is the idea. And much as we discussed, he plays g4. The king can go back to f7, but then g5 wins. Fabi just pushes his pawn all the way to g6. And this wins. And so MVL has to stick around here, and he resigns after king g6. Because if knight e7 check, the king slides into f7. And who can tell me what the fastest win is here? Well, you see the computer. So rook f5, rook takes d5, and rook king f6. Now, somebody was asking me to show why it's a draw with a knight on g7. Why was that the key drawing idea? Absolutely. So the reason that's a fortress is, and let's go back to the last moment in which he had a chance to do that. So here, knight c7, king f4, knight e6, sorry, knight e6, king g4, knight g7. What if white's rook swings around and you try to push black off the board? Well, first of all, you can now move the knight because the king is on g6. So you can go here. But you can probably also go here. Yes. And white cannot make progress. Right? There's just nothing that white can do. White has to eventually move the king. Now, white can try to go around the other way. But at some point, you can just try to win this pawn with your knight. So, yeah. And once you push the g pawn, there's really no winning attempts. Because now, you can't go knight g7, you can go knight c7. The problem with pushing the g-pawn is that the pathway to h5 has been shut down by the pawn. And if you go g5, then you blunder a fork. Well, black will always have one of these checks. So that's why the knight on g7 would have made a draw. That's what MVL missed. What he missed was the significance of allowing white's king to come to h5. That was what the whole battle revolved around. That's why Fabi made a mistake by going king g4. Fabi himself did not realize, at least initially, he realized it later, which is absolutely insane. He realized later that when black's knight does not have access to g7, you can induce Zugzwang one way or another by pushing black off and creating a situation where the king forcibly either reaches g4 or you force black's pieces to the side of the board and then win the pawn. You could, I mean, yeah, without the engine, you could. You could figure this out, but it would be very, very hard. It would take many, many hours. Well, how do I figure out that this is the target position? Well, I reasoned logically that if you're trying to win this with white, you want to win the pawn. To win the pawn, you need to get your king close to the pawn. And we already figured out that the f5 is not the proper way to do it, because the f5 square will always be checked by black's knight. So it's nothing to do with chess. Directionally speaking, the only other pathway to the pawn is to go from the h file to g6. And we know that the king is very hard to dislodge from the h file, especially by the knight. And so that's why we want to go there. MVL thought that he could stop it with his knight being on h6 because it controls g4, failing to realize that eventually his knight would be pried off of that square, right? This being the critical Zugzwang position. This is the Zugzwang. Black has to make a decisive weakening of his position, allowing the king to come to h5. And that concludes the analysis. MVL officially resigned after king g6 because his pieces have been pushed off and the pawn will be lost.